On a windy Thursday in September 1979, Earl Ford rolled into a Hutchinson equipment lot in a 1972 Chevrolet C20 pickup with 286,000 miles, oxidized blue paint, and a left fender held in line by baling twine and stubborn habit. Dust trailed him across the gravel like a second vehicle. The truck door groaned, and Earl stepped down in patched overalls, a sun-faded coat, and boots dark with grease from a morning spent under a planter frame. By the way eyes tracked from his truck to his cuffs, Earl could tell most men at that lot placed him in the category they used for cautionary tales. Barely hanging on. One dry year from done. Wade Kessler met him near a row of bright tractors with mirrored glass and fresh rubber. Wade wore a pressed pearl snap shirt with the dealership logo, a clean cap that looked never bent by rain, and boots that had not seen a manure alley in months. Behind him sat a 180-horsepower unit, marked at $96,800, with financing posters that promised expansion at 9.9%. Wade glanced at Earl's truck, then at Earl's cuffs, then back to the tractor. "You cannot keep farming with salvage and wire," Wade said. "Serious operators finance growth." Earl looked at the price tag, then at the monthly payment chart clipped to a stand. He did quick arithmetic in silence. With 20% down and 7 years financed, that machine was over $1,250 each month before insurance. He answered with his usual economy. "If I cannot pay cash, I wait." A pair of growers by the office window laughed softly, not cruelly, but with the confidence of men who assumed the math had already chosen winners and losers. Earl nodded once, not offended, and asked for a parts catalog instead of a sales sheet. Wade gave a small, finished nod, the kind that told Earl the salesman had filed him away. What the lot did not know was this. Earl's household budget that year was $11,840 total, documented to the dollar in a spiral ledger at home. Groceries were $2,100. Clothing was $460. Utilities, fuel, taxes, and insurance were controlled line by line. Consumer debt payments were exactly $0. Earl held $18,600 in Treasury bills, yielding 8.4% and another $9,200 in immediate cash reserves. They also did not see his private rule, written on the inside cover of that ledger in block letters. No machine, no acre, no exception unless 1 full year of payments already sits in the bank. Earl's discipline did not come from one dramatic lesson. It came from accumulation, just like his money. He grew up 10 miles outside Concordia, in a house that shook in winter wind and stayed cool in summer because his mother opened windows at dawn and shut them before noon. His father, Dale Ford, farmed rented ground with used equipment and a deep suspicion of interest that sounded old-fashioned in good years and prophetic in bad ones. Dale was not a speechmaker. He taught by repetition. Drain oil while warm. Buy after harvest, never during planting panic. Keep seed money separate from pride money. When Earl was 12, a neighbor named Calvin Rusk lost his place after 3 rate adjustments in 16 months. The original note started at 8.25%. It reset to 11.4, then 13.1. By the auction date, the effective burden on 2 notes and an operating line was above what his yields could carry. Earl stood with his father at the edge of that crowd and watched machinery sell in 20-second bids that erased 20 years of work. No one mocked Calvin. He was respected. He had simply believed expansion would outrun interest forever. It did not. On the drive home, Dale said 5 words Earl remembered for life. Debt hunts in all weather. By the second week of October 1976, Earl had started renting his first 80 acres on a crop share arrangement that left little room for error and no room for ego. He was 21, slept lightly, and tracked every cost in ruled columns: seed, diesel, twine, bearings. He discovered quickly that discipline is not one decision. It is thousands of dull ones made when nobody's watching. He repaired chains instead of replacing assemblies. He welded cracked brackets after supper under a single bulb. He bought filters by the case in winter discounts. When a neighbor upgraded, Earl offered cash for the old implement before trade-in shaved value off it. His first 3 years on his own looked unremarkable from the road and extraordinary on paper. In 1977, gross crop receipts reached $64,300, and net after all farm expenses came to $21,840. He saved $9,100. In 1978, gross reached $79,450, and net reached $33,220. He saved $14,400 by postponing equipment upgrades and rebuilding a used drill with $370 in parts. In 1979, with 320 rented acres under management, gross climbed to $118,700 and net reached $37,340 despite fuel pressure. He directed $18,600 into treasury bills and kept $9,200 liquid. He tracked not just revenue, but avoided cost, and avoided cost became his hidden engine. In Reno and Cloud counties, Earl had learned that people often mistook quiet living for financial strain, because quiet living and strain can look identical from 50 feet away. Earl still mended work shirts. He still bought coffee in bulk tins. He still drove to town only with a list. His kitchen table held a jar for spare bolts, a calculator with worn number keys, and envelopes marked seed, tax, insurance, repairs. He ring-fenced 12 months of non-negotiables first. Only after those envelopes were full did he discuss expansion with himself. That practice shaped every major decision in those years. At a farm auction outside Glasgow in February 1980, bidders crowded around a 1974 John Deere 4430 with faded paint and 7,900 hours. The cab seal leaked. One hydraulic line sweated under load. Several buyers dismissed it as a money pit and turned to newer units with financing options. Earl inspected the engine block for casting cracks, checked compression history and service notes, and bid to $11,400 cash. He spent $1,260 on immediate repairs, then another $1,600 over the year on preventive work. Total first-year equipment cost, $14,260. A comparable financed upgrade would have pulled around $38,000 that year in note payments, insurance differences, and depreciation exposure. The 4430 became his primary field tractor, not glamorous, fully paid. In August 1980, a neighbor offered a newer planter on terms with no payment for 6 months. Earl declined. He rebuilt his own planter chain drive, replaced wear plates, and recalibrated spacing for $640 in parts and 2 long evenings. Stand counts held. Yield penalties were negligible. Cash remained available for inputs bought at discount. On fertilizer, he paid early and captured a 3% cash reduction, saving $2,340 across his acreage that season. On crop insurance and property tax reserves, he pre-funded both into separate accounts before harvest started. Earl treated that separation as non-negotiable after watching too many seasons turn on timing. By January 1981, his books showed a pattern that looked almost plain until one compared trajectories. Earl's peers with aggressive financing often carried larger gross revenues, but thinner resilience. Earl carried lower fixed obligations and stronger liquidity. He had no term machinery note, no revolving consumer balance, no payment schedule that could accelerate if rates moved. He was not anti-growth. He was anti-fragility. Growth, in his framework, had to survive a bad year on paper before it touched real life. Wade Kessler kept pressing through that winter, sometimes in person, sometimes through catalog mailers with promotional rates in red ink. At a coffee stop near Hutchinson, Wade told a small table that Earl was undercapitalized, that old iron would trap him, that scale was the future, and waiting was a luxury. From what Earl knew of those coffee stop tables, the men listening would have weighed risk through the tools they had been taught. Earl heard about the comment 2 days later and did what he usually did with criticism. He entered numbers in his ledger and returned to work. On the last evening of February 1981, he sat at his kitchen table after feeding checks and reviewed his annual household sheet one more time. $11,840 total personal spending, still below many monthly machinery obligations in the county. Groceries, $2,100, clothing, $460, zero consumer debt payments, farm reserves fully ring-fenced, treasury income posted, cash positions stable. Outside, the 1972 Chevrolet cooled beside the shed, its wired fender unmoved by a pinion, waiting for morning. Morning came thin and gray over Clout County, and the first sound in Earl Ford's kitchen was not weather, but the wall phone ringing at 5:42. He wiped his hands on a towel, picked up on the second ring, and heard Harold Baines from Wichita speaking in the careful tone of a man who had rehearsed numbers before dawn. Harold said he was selling all 320 acres Earl rented, that the full price was $640,000, and that outside the 1972 Chevrolet sat under a weak porch light, left fender still held true by baling twine, looking exactly like a truck that belonged to a tenant with no options. Earl pulled the calculator close and wrote the land number first in thick graphite, $640,000. Then he wrote two paths beneath it. Path 1, conventional financing at 12.75% variable, 20-year amortization, monthly payment close to $6,980 before taxes and insurance, annual debt service near $83,760 with reset risk if rates moved higher. Path 2, cash-heavy purchase plus structured seller carry with no banknote. He overlaid those paths against his farm records. 3-year average annual net farm income after expenses at $92,400. That margin was too narrow for a variable note riding weather and commodity swings. One poor wheat year and the arithmetic would bite through bone. He opened a second ledger and checked available liquidity line by line. Treasury bills had matured and rolled cleanly. Grain sale proceeds were segregated. Repair reserves were intact. Household spending was still below $12,000 a year. By 7:10 that morning, he had mapped the only version that kept the operation resilient. Write a certified check for $384,000, then pay the remaining $256,000 in 16 quarterly installments from ring-fenced grain sales, no lender attached, no floating rate, no demand clause. That plan did not come from nerve. It came from repetition across years that looked dull to everyone except the man writing them. Harold had rented those acres to Earl because Earl paid on date, left fences better than he found them, and never padded excuses with theater. Back in 1977, when Hale cut one field hard and Yields missed target, Earl still delivered rent in full and showed Harold the books without being asked. Gross receipts that season were $64,300, net was $21,840, and rent obligations were met from first allocation, not leftovers. In 1978, with better yields and tighter input timing, gross moved to $79,450 and net to $33,220. Earl saved $14,400 instead of upgrading machinery to impress neighbors. In 1979, gross reached $118,700, net reached $37,340, and he parked $18,600 in Treasury bills at 8.4% while preserving $9,200 liquid. He did not call those years sacrifice. He called them setup. Each avoided payment became dry powder for the day land would come available without warning. He kept turning pages, and the pages read like a private operating manual written against panic. 1976. First rented 80 acres, no term debt, net saved $4,780. 1977. Bought used cultivator at estate sale, $1,900 cash, rebuilt shanks for $240, avoided dealer package at $7,600 financed. 1978. Repaired grain auger motor for $185 instead of replacing at $2,400. 1979. Funded full year of seed and insurance reserves before harvest. 1980. Bought the 1974 John Deere 4430 at $11,400, then put $1,260 immediate repairs and $1,600 preventive into it. Total $14,260 first year versus roughly $38,000 annual burden on a financed, newer unit, once payment, premium, and depreciation exposure were counted. Early 1981, household budget confirmed at $11,840, groceries $2,100, clothing $460, consumer debt payments $0. Across 5 seasons, the same principle appeared in different clothing. Keep fixed obligations low, keep cash flexible, and do not borrow fragility because someone else calls it growth. By noon, he had already completed chores, showered, and changed into his least-worn work shirt, which still carried a stitched elbow patch his mother had sewn 3 winters earlier. He drove east to Wichita in the rust-streaked Chevrolet, engine steady at 55, radio off, legal pad on the seat with his numbers copied twice. The office where Harold worked used polished stone in the lobby and had an investment representative already waiting when Earl arrived, a man in a tailored suit with a bright watch and a folder branded by the Lender Group. The representative looked once at Earl's boots, once at his truck keys, and then delivered his prepared pressure in a smooth, low voice. He said modern operators leveraged assets, that delay would cost control, that variable rates could be refinanced when markets normalized. He slid a worksheet across the table with a projected first-year payment schedule and optimistic yield assumptions. Earl read it in silence for less than a minute, circled 2 lines, and handed it back. Input costs understated. Interest reset exposure unmodeled. He did not argue personality. He argued math. Harold asked the representative for 10 minutes alone with Earl. They moved to a smaller conference room with a scratched oak table and a window facing a parking lot. Earl placed his legal pad flat, walked Harold through his 2-path calculation, and then reached into a plain envelope for a certified check made out that morning, $384,000. He set it down between them without flourish. Harold stared at the amount, then at Earl's face, then at the notes. Earl proposed the balance of $256,000 through 16 quarterly installments of $16,000, sourced from segregated grain sale proceeds held in a dedicated account with clear default language but no bank involvement and no interest. Harold asked one question that mattered. "Can you keep paying in drought?" Earl answered in 7 words. "I already funded failure before good years." Harold leaned back, looked through the window for a long count, and then nodded. He said he had expected negotiation theater, maybe bravado, maybe threat. He had received arithmetic and a check. By late afternoon, they signed a seller-financed contract at 0% interest, deed transfer secured under terms both could explain without a lawyer in the room. On paper, it was a transaction. In practice, it was trust priced in numbers. The room stayed quiet after the signatures dried. Harold folded his copy. Earl slid the deed papers into a manila folder, and both men looked once more at the figures on the table as if checking weather before harvest. Neither man called it victory. It was an agreement built the only way Earl trusted anything that could fail under pressure. Numbers first, terms plain, and enough margin left for a bad year. Earl drove home after dark with the deed documents in a manila folder under the seat and stopped once for diesel, paying cash to the penny. He did not celebrate in town. He fed cattle, checked a leaky valve on the nurse tank, and entered the first obligation into a new ledger marked Bain's Contract. Quarterly installment 1, due June 30th, $16,000, already pre-funded from projected wheat and milo receipts at conservative yield assumptions. In Hutchinson and Concordia, the first version of the story traveled by coffee cup and half-heard detail. Some said Harold had gone soft. Some said Earl had found hidden backers. Wade Kessler heard by Saturday and told 2 customers the same line he had used before, that undercapitalized operators sometimes made one lucky deal. He did not yet know that Earl had just secured control of 320 acres with 0 bank interest while preserving operating flexibility. Earl, for his part, rose before sunrise Sunday, greased the 4430, and went back to the field as if nothing public had happened at all. By Monday morning, Earl had the Bain's Contract ledger open beside a cup of reheated coffee, and the first 3 entries were already written in hard pencil: June 30th, September 30th, December 31st, each for $16,000, each tagged to grain sale lots before those bushels left the bin. He treated the deed the same way he treated a hydraulic rebuild, not as a trophy, but as a maintenance commitment with deadlines. Through spring planting, he kept the 1974 John Deere 443. On a strict service cycle, spent $2,860 on parts for the year, and declined 2 equipment offers that would have added $31,000 to $39,000 in annual fixed obligations. His 1981 farm gross came in at $141,280. After operating expenses, insurance, taxes, and household draw, net cash flow was $51,940. He sent $48,000 to Harold in 3 quarterly installments and carried $3,940 forward, plus intact reserves. It was narrow by design. No wasted motion, no borrowed buffer. By the end of 1982, his system had become almost mechanical in its consistency, and that was precisely the point. He rotated wheat, milo, and fallow acreage to protect moisture, pre-bought fertilizer only when he could capture a cash discount above 2.5%, and refused to count optimistic yields in any payment plan. Gross receipts reached $156,740 that year, helped by timely rains and stronger basis at delivery. Net, after all, farm costs reached $68,320. He paid 4 quarterly installments, $64,000 total, and still added $4,320 to reserves. Then he wrote a year-by-year strip in the margin, the same way he had done since he was 21, 1981, 3 installments paid, $48,000, no missed date. 1982, 4 installments paid, $64,000, no interest charged. 1983 projection, stress test at 30 bushels wheat, and $3.10 cash, still solvent. 1984 projection, stress test at 24 bushels and higher diesel, still meeting land terms if household stays below budget cap. 1985 projection, final installment and title, clear under original structure. It looked plain on the page, but the arithmetic underneath was non-trivial. Every avoided machinery note preserved liquidity, and preserved liquidity protected land ownership when weather stopped cooperating. The first week of April 1983 brought that weather problem in slowly and then all at once. Dry topsoil, thin subsoil moisture, and wind that took what little was left. Earl adjusted immediately. He cut discretionary passes, delayed one non-essential repair, and moved $11,400 from post-harvest equipment savings into a ring-fenced operating protection account, marked seed tax insurance 12 months. That same season, he bought 160 acres from an estate north of the Baines tract at $1,040 per acre, $166,400 total, paid in cash from retained earnings that were separate from installment funds. No bank signature, no floating covenant. By December 1983, his gross was down to $119,600 as yields softened, yet fixed obligations remained controlled enough that net still reached $37,880 after the fourth annual $64,000 paid to Harold. In 1984, with drought pressure deepening, gross slipped again to $104,920. Net narrowed to $28,140. He still paid all 4 $16,000 installments on date by drawing from pre-assigned grain proceeds and reserve transfers he had planned a year earlier. On March 31, 1985, he wrote, Installment 16, $16,000, and closed the Baines ledger at exactly $640,000. Principal paid, 0 interest, 0 penalties, 0 renegotiations. The deed was no longer a contract objective. It was settled ownership. While Earl was compressing risk, other good operators were making decisions that looked rational in the prevailing consensus of the time. Dealers were pushing scale. Lenders were still quoting growth language, and many families had valid reasons to believe expansion would distribute fixed costs across more acres. Tom Abernathy, who farmed west of Concordia and had a reputation for clean rows and fair dealing, financed 640 acres at terms that started at 10.5% variable with annual reset clauses. He also rolled in 2 newer tractors and a combine package because delayed replacement had already cost him labor and timing in wet harvest windows. On paper, in year 1, the framework penciled out. His annualized debt service sat just under expected net operating income under average yield assumptions. The trade-offs were known but accepted. Narrower margin, faster growth, less repair downtime. Tom was not careless. He was making the same decision extension meetings and banker brochures had framed as modern farm management. Luis Mendez, south of Clifton, followed a similar path for different reasons. His operation had labor constraints and aging equipment that kept failing during narrow planting windows. He took on $412,000 in machinery debt at a blended 11.2%, structured over 7 years with seasonal payment concentration after harvest. The monthly equivalent burden was around $7,050 before maintenance, and he accepted it because missed planting dates had already cost him too many bushels. In 1982, that choice looked workable. In 1983, with sorghum stress and weaker cash grain pricing, it looked tight. In 1984, after a second underperforming season, it became a structural trap. Interest did not wait for rainfall. Payment schedules did not care that heads filled short. Luis kept paying as long as he could, sold discretionary assets, and worked through weekends on custom jobs, but the note balance moved slower than his cash position. His story was common in those years and heavy to watch because effort was never the issue. Carla Pritchard's family operation carried a different vulnerability. Their debt-to-asset ratio looked acceptable, while land values were stable, and her parents had pledged acreage as collateral to secure operating lines and equipment terms during the expansion wave. When valuations softened and lenders tightened collateral standards, one renewal cycle changed the whole equation. They were asked to post additional security, could not, and faced acceleration terms that converted a manageable payment rhythm into immediate distress. Their auction day drew neighbors who respected them and wished they had better timing by one season. Ben Holloway, farther into Reno County, held together 2 difficult years by carrying input costs on revolving credit, expecting one recovery crop to clear the stack. Instead, fertilizer, fuel, and feed remained elevated while yields sagged. His revolver climbed past levels that his livestock margin could service, and after selling his herd to cover near-term obligations, he filed Chapter 12. None of them were reckless. They were competent producers operating inside a debt-heavy paradigm that left no room for clustered shocks. By July 1985, the drought had become the defining force across Cloud and Reno counties. Dryland wheat that had averaged 46 bushels per acre in healthier years dropped toward 21. Cash wheat hovered near $3.18 per bushel, too low to absorb rising per-acre input strain once fixed payments were layered on top. Local operating lines repriced higher, variable notes reset, and bankers who had once rewarded expansion shifted to preservation language almost overnight. In that environment, 2 financial models stood side by side in stark contrast. Model 1 carried high fixed debt service and depended on average weather to remain solvent. Model 2 carried minimal fixed obligations and could withstand yield compression by shrinking variable spend and drawing reserves. Earl had built Model 2 long before those words were used in meetings. His 1985 household budget remained under $12,600. He did not add personal lifestyle pressure. He did not add consumer debt. He ran old equipment, accepted more repair hours, and kept liquidity where it could do real work. The 1986 season did not offer immediate relief, yet his framework still held. He pre-funded taxes and insurance before first harvest load, spent $3,140 on machinery upkeep instead of signing a finance replacement, and captured a 3.1% cash discount on fertilizer by buying after a brief price break. That discount alone saved $4,020 across his acres. He kept 1 full year of non-negotiable farm expenses in separate accounts and treated those balances as untouchable, except for their assigned purpose. By post-harvest, his combined operating and reserve balances were $286,700, with no term loans outstanding. Through 1987, as some land came to market under stress, he bought another 320 acres at an average $1,205 per acre, total $385,600, entirely from retained earnings and contract grain proceeds. Controlled ground reached 800 acres then, not through speed, but through survival, arithmetic repeated over and over. In coffee shops from Hutchinson to Concordia, people who had once read his patched sleeves as failure began to reconsider what they had actually been seeing. 3 days after Ben Holloway's filing became public record, Earl drove the C-20 to visit him with a legal pad and no speeches. They sat at Ben's table for 2 hours and mapped variable costs line by line, identifying what could be cut, what had to be preserved, and what timeline would keep his smaller acreage viable once court restructuring settled. Earl did similar quiet help for Carla Pritchard's family after their auction, introducing them to a seed cleaning operator who needed reliable seasonal labor, and eventually discussing cooperative ownership as a future path. He could not reverse what had already happened to Tom or Luis, and he never pretended he could, but he kept showing up with numbers instead of judgment. By early 1988, the county narrative had shifted into a more nuanced understanding. Wealth and fragility did not look the way most people assume from trucks, coats, or coffee shop confidence. Earl still drove the same rusted Chevrolet. He still answered in short lines. Yet the ledger under his elbow was now the strongest balance sheet on several roads. And the next person to notice that up close would be Wade Kessler. Wade Kessler pulled into Earl Ford's yard on a bright April afternoon in 1988 with a dealership demo combine behind his 1-ton truck and a rehearsed pitch in his shirt pocket. He expected resistance, maybe a short refusal, maybe another line about paying cash. What he did not expect was to find Earl kneeling beside a 50-gallon drum workbench, sorting receipts into date order with the same care he used on bearings and seals. The yard looked poor to a passing eye. The old Chevrolet C-20 sat near the shed with fresh rust on the rocker panels and the same left fender wired in place. Earl's coat was faded at the shoulders. His gloves were patched twice in the palms. Nothing in that picture announced wealth. Wade started anyway. New machine efficiency, lower harvest loss, limited time terms. He quoted a payment schedule that began manageable and then stepped up in year 3. Earl listened, then wiped his hands and said, "Come inside. I will show you why not." In the kitchen, he opened a ledger thick enough to sit flat from use, pages dense with tight block handwriting. The column headers were plain: year, decision, cash cost, financed equivalent, interest avoided, cumulative total. Wade stood while Earl ran a finger down the entries. Rebuilt planter drive in 1980, avoided financed replacement spread. 4,430 repairs instead of note package. Cash fertilizer discounts captured each winter. No revolving carry, no reset clauses, no late fees. It was not theater. It was line item arithmetic over time. Near the back of the book, Earl had added a long-range column he called a 30-year avoidance projection, built from historical terms that dealers and lenders had offered him and peers over the previous decade. The cumulative interest not paid, through realized and contract equivalent comparisons, read $1,742,300. Wade looked at that number twice, then asked if Earl was counting fantasy savings. Earl slid over source sheets clipped by year, dealer quote, copies, bank amortization printouts, insurance riders, and actual repair invoices. Wade asked one more question, less confident now. "What is your real cash position today?" Earl answered without emphasis. "Post-harvest, operating and reserves together, $913,440. Wade took out a business card, called a bank contact in Salina from Earl's wall phone, and asked for verification he thought would expose exaggeration. The banker did not share account details, but he confirmed what Wade had asked, in coded language they both understood. Earl's balances were consistent with the stated figure, and there were no term loans on file. Wade thanked him, hung up slowly, and stayed quiet for several seconds. The room held only the hum of an old refrigerator and the tick of a kitchen clock that had missed 5 minutes every month for years. Wade closed the ledger, handed it back, and said, "I misread you." Earl nodded once. Most people did. By the second week of May 1988, coffee shop talk from Hutchinson to Concordia had changed tone. The joke stopped first. Then the certainty stopped. Men who had called Earl undercapitalized began using a different phrase. Quietly, almost reluctantly. Liquid. The visible facts had not changed. Same truck, same overalls, same house paint peeling near the porch posts. The underlying facts had been there all along, just hidden in discipline no one found interesting until pressure exposed it. Before we go any further, if you want to know how that ledger turned from private protection into public rescue, stay with this all the way to the end. The next 6 years were not dramatic from the road, but they were decisive in the books. Earl stayed with the same operating rules and used retained earnings to expand only when the numbers survived stress tests. In 1989, he set a cap that machinery upkeep could rise to $4,500, but never trigger financing. In 1990, he bought 48,000 bushels of additional grain storage capacity with cash at harvest off-season pricing and cut basis loss exposure by an estimated 17 cents per bushel on average delivery timing. In 1991, he passed on a package deal that offered low introductory rates and then variable resets. In 1992 and 1993, he held reserve targets above 12 months of seed, tax, and insurance requirements even when neighbors called that dead money. It was not dead. It was dormant strength. Then in 1994, when another tract came available, he purchased 360 acres at $1,420 per acre, $511,200 total, paid from retained earnings and grain account transfers, no bank lien, no covenant trigger. That brought total controlled ground to 1,160 acres, exactly where his long ledger had projected, if he stayed patient and avoided interest drag. He did not celebrate publicly. He updated fence maps, set maintenance schedules, and wrote one line in the margin of the ledger: scale without fragility achieved. 20 years later, in October 2008, a different kind of pressure hit. Credit tightened fast. Operating lines that had rolled smoothly for years were repriced or reduced. Younger producers with decent yields and clean reputations suddenly faced expensive renewals and harder collateral demands. By spring 2009, local operating rates in the region were moving through the sevens, then above, while input prices stayed elevated enough to squeeze any thin margin. Earl was in his 50s then, still driving the same truck now well past 350,000 miles, still keeping personal spending below many families' annual vehicle payments. He looked at the county balance sheets he could see, listened to the calls he was getting, and made the largest decision of his life without a speech. He formed the Ford Grounded Acres Fund at $3 million, capitalized from liquid reserves and contracted grain proceeds. The rules were written on 2 pages, plain language, no hidden clauses, 0% interest bridge notes, maximum 5-year term, quarterly reporting required, not to control recipients, but to force visibility. One condition attached to every note: when stable, each recipient must mentor 1 new producer for 2 full seasons. Earl said the condition out loud only once to a room of applicants. Help must compound, or it is a bandage. Tom Abernathy was first. He had never regained his original footprint after losing 640 acres in the drought years, but he had rebuilt skills and rented ground carefully. Earl gave him a $180,000 zero-interest reset loan structured over 5 years, $9,000 due each quarter, with first payment deferred 2 quarters to let working capital breathe. Tom used $124,000 to retire a high-rate carryover note, $36,000 for input pre-buys at cash discounts, and $20,000 for repairs that prevented in-season downtime. By year 3, he was current and profitable on 300 leased acres. By year 5, the note was paid in full, and his reserve account held 4 months of operating costs. Tom then mentored a 26-year-old tenant from Clyde through 2 planning cycles, as required. Luis Mendez came next with machinery fatigue and fragmented obligations still haunting him years after his original debt spiral. Earl extended $210,000 at 0% over 5 years. Quarterly payment $10,500, tied to a strict equipment triage plan instead of replacement shopping. Louise used the money to retire expensive short-term paper, rebuild 2 tractors and a header, and consolidate parts inventory to avoid panic purchases. He did custom harvest work in off windows, directed those earnings to principal, and cleared the note in 57 months. By 2026, he owned his repaired equipment outright and operated 420 acres with no term debt. Carla Pritchard did not need a loan first. She needed a platform. Earl structured a $240,000 grant from the fund to launch a seed cleaning cooperative near Concordia, with $110,000 for facility retrofit, $58,000 for processing equipment, $42,000 for initial payroll and training, and $30,000 in contingency. The cooperative opened with 4 member farms and seasonal contracts. Within 4 years, it served 23 farms, reduced outsourced cleaning costs, and produced steady local wages. Carla met her mentorship condition by training 2 beginning producers in quality standards and contract pricing. Ben Holloway's case was as much personal as financial. He had sold his herd and carried the weight of that loss for years. Earl paired a $125,000 zero-interest bridge note with counseling and independent restructuring support, then required monthly cash flow reporting for 18 months. Ben downsized to a 160-acre mixed operation, rebuilt slowly, and paid off the note in just under 5 years. He now tracks input exposure. With a conservative planning template, he teaches to younger farmers at winter meetings, quietly, without drama. By early 2012, the first cycle of 12 fund recipients was active. 4 were the named cases everyone knew. 8 were less visible families who asked for privacy but accepted the same mentorship clause and the same reporting discipline. Principal deployed across the 12 notes and 1 grant reached $2,146,000, leaving a buffer in the fund for contingencies and administration. Repayment rates held above projections because the terms removed interest pressure and forced planning behavior. Oh, failures still happened at the field level. Late frost did not disappear. Hail still came. But financial collapse became less common because fixed burdens were lighter and decisions were made earlier. If you are learning something from this, Pass it to someone who thinks growth always means borrowing more. Then came the 2022 rate shock, and the county saw the difference between fragile scale and grounded scale in a second generation. Operating lines quoted between 7.25 and 8.1%. Machinery refinance denials increased, and input inflation pushed above 18% year over year in key categories. Earl responded with the same framework he had used since 1979, just at larger scale. He purchased 2 foreclosed parcels totaling 520 acres for $2,236,000 cash, then resold both at his exact cost basis to the former owner's adult children on 20-year, 0% contracts. No markup, no extraction. Each contract included annual financial reviews and a right of first refusal that kept outside consolidators from stripping the ground out of local hands. Let me stop here and ask you something. When pressure rises, do you protect appearances first or resilience first? The deeper examination sits in the numbers, and the numbers are stubborn. Earl's core mechanism was debt service avoided, plus discount capture, plus timing control. Between 1979 and 2026, his ledgers show cumulative machinery and land loan interest avoided at $1,742,300 against realistic term offers. He declined. Cash, fertilizer, and input discounts, documented by invoice timing and pricing sheets, added another $486,000 in saved cost over decades. Basis and storage timing improvements from paid-for bins added an estimated $612,000 in additional realized grain revenue. Combined structural advantage, $2,840,300 before land appreciation. That is why modest annual nets compounded into strategic freedom. His year strip for the critical growth phase reads like this. 1988 to 1993, retained earnings averaged $82,400 annually after all expenses and reserves, with no term debt added. 1994 bought 360 acres for $511,200 cash. 1995 to 2007, average annual retained earnings $134,000, with selective land improvements paid from cash flow. 2008, established $3 million fund. 2009 to 2016, fund repayments recycled into new bridge notes while preserving principal coverage. 2022, acquired and reassigned 520 acres at cost, $2,236,000, financed internally at 0%. 2026, audited net worth $14,870,000 across land, storage, and cash equivalents. Personal spending still below $19,000 per year. The pattern is multifaceted but clear. Low fixed obligations gave him optionality. Optionality let him buy during distress. Ownership without lien gave him durability when rates moved. The recipient trajectories prove the second half of the thesis. Tom, Luis, Carla, and Ben were not rescued by charity detached from accountability. They were stabilized by patient capital tied to reporting and mentorship. 12 assisted farms now steward 4,980 acres with an estimated market value near $31,400,000. The multiplier is not rhetorical. It is arithmetic. One disciplined balance sheet created 12 more resilient ones, and those 12 now train the next line of producers under the same zero interest, no theater logic. Wade Kessler's resolution came without spectacle. At a county meeting after the 2022 season, he stood up and said he had spent 20 years pushing notes that made dealerships rich and left farms exposed when weather and rates moved together. He shifted his business to certified used equipment and repair-first consulting, then taught interest risk math to younger sales staff before retiring in 2029. Earl did not comment when told. He simply wrote another line in the ledger margin at home that night. Truth arrived late, but it arrived. Truth arrived late, but it arrived, and once it did, it altered how help moved through the county. Earl did not turn the fund into a ceremony circuit or a branded program with signs on fences. He turned it into process. Each recipient sat at his kitchen table with 3 documents: a quarterly cash flow sheet, a cost per acre worksheet, and a mentorship log that had to be filled in with names, dates, and what was actually taught. No one was asked for gratitude language. Everyone was asked for arithmetic. By March 2023, the 12 original recipients had completed 41 cumulative mentoring seasons because several of them chose to mentor beyond the minimum 2-year requirement. Tom Abernathy's arc became the clearest example of stability replacing pride. His 300 leased acres in 2023 produced an average net of $312 per acre after direct input costs and machinery upkeep, and he kept $94,000 in working capital instead of rolling gains into faster expansion. In 2024, a late freeze cut wheat quality, but his fixed obligations remained low enough that he still ended positive by $38,600. In 2025, he signed a longer lease on an additional 60 acres only after placing 1 full year of rent in reserve, copying Earl's rule almost word for word. Tom's mentorship farmer, Eli Dawson, entered on 120 acres with 1 paid-for tractor and no operating cushion. By 2026, Eli had 6 months of expenses, ring-fenced and no revolving balance. Tom called that result better than any yield record he had ever posted. Luis Mendez rebuilt with even tighter controls than before. He moved from reactive repairs to scheduled maintenance, setting a fixed annual machinery reserve of $27,000 and refusing to exceed it except for documented safety failures. His 420-acre operation in 2026 posted gross receipts of $886,400 across grain and custom work, with net retained earnings of $146,200 after family draw, taxes, and reserve funding. He kept a 1-page rule on the shop wall: no signature today that requires hope tomorrow. Louis mentored Marisol Vega and Trent Holloway through equipment triage, showing them how a $3,400 engine overhaul can outperform a financed replacement that carries $22,000 annual debt service. Marisol now farms 190 acres with her sister on a cash input schedule. Trent, Ben's nephew, runs 140 acres and a side welding business, both debt-free. Carla Pritchard's cooperative produced the strongest multiplier in pure community terms. Her seed cleaning facility began with 4 member farms and reached 31 by the 2025 season, processing 418,000 bushels with documented quality premiums that averaged 23 cents per bushel above prior local outcomes. That spread created $96,140 in aggregate member value in 1 season alone, before counting reduced transport costs. Carla used retained surplus to install upgraded screens and a second gravity table for $84,000 cash. No equipment line attached. She mentored 2 beginning producers each cycle and then added a bookkeeping workshop that taught families to separate household, operating, and capital accounts. By winter 2026, 7 farms that used her workshop had eliminated high-interest carry balances entirely. Ben Holloway's turnaround stayed quieter, but it held. His 160-acre mixed operation no longer chased maximum acreage. It chased resilience. He capped annual family living costs at $44,800, held crop input pre-buys to cash-only windows, and built a livestock feed reserve that reduced emergency buying by 63% over 3 years. His 2026 book showed $71,900, retained after all costs, with 0 term loans and 0 revolving carry. Ben mentored 2 younger operators through stress year planning, including one scenario where yields dropped 20% and diesel rose 15% simultaneously. He used to avoid meetings. Now he led one session each January and left immediately after the numbers were done. The 8 recipients who requested privacy remained private, but their outcomes were audited inside the fund records. Collectively, they repaid $1,391,000 in principal on schedule, carried a delinquency rate below 1.2%, and increased owned or controlled acreage from 2,140 to 3,040 without variable rate land notes. 6 of the 8 now mentor at least one producer annually. Across all 12 original recipients, the mentorship clause produced 19 second-generation participants by 2026. That is the multiplier effect in plain form. 12 direct notes and 1 grant became 31 stabilized operations, touching 7,420 acres under conservative debt structures. Earl never called it legacy. He called it proper compounding. Wade Kessler's own resolution unfolded just as quietly as his concession. After that county meeting, he spent 2023 rewriting his dealership contracts and incentive plans. Commission weights shifted away from financed new equipment and towards certified used sales, repair support packages, and total cost of ownership disclosures. Sales staff had to show side-by-side 5-year cash flow projections at 3 rate scenarios before any deal could close. In 2024, Wade's dealerships sold fewer high-horsepower new units, but doubled service retention and reduced customer defaults sharply. He began hosting spring classes for younger dealers from Reno and Cloud counties, walking them through the same interest reset arithmetic he once dismissed. Some attendees said the sessions were uncomfortable. Wade agreed. He kept teaching anyway. By the second week of October 2028, Wade had trained 17 junior sales managers and published a plain language worksheet titled Rate Risk Before Paint Color, used in 3 neighboring counties. He retired in 2029 as planned, financially secure, without trying to rewrite his own past. He told one reporter from a regional farm paper that he spent 2 decades mistaking motion for strength. Earl read that line at his kitchen table, folded the clipping once, and filed it in a folder marked Dealer Notes, the same folder that held old quote sheets from the years when no one believed his math. Where everyone stood by 2026 could be listed cleanly, and Earl insisted on clean lists. Harold Baines was 81, retired in Wichita, and still told friends his best transaction was the day a tenant arrived with a certified check and a payment map that needed no legal fog. Tom Abernathy managed leased ground profitably and had not missed a reserve target in 5 consecutive years. Louis Mendez owned his machinery outright and had begun a gradual succession plan with his daughters based on cash thresholds, not inheritance assumptions. Carla Pritchard chaired the cooperative board and funded 2 annual technical scholarships of $7,500 each for local ag mechanics training. Ben Holloway ran his smaller farm with steadier sleep, mentored in winter, and no longer measured success by acreage alone. Calvin Rusk, the neighbor Earl had watched lose his place decades earlier, spent his later years in Salina, and passed away in 2018. His son now leases 90 acres and keeps no variable rate term debt, saying the family learned one lesson the hard way and one lesson from watching Earl. Dale Ford passed in 2006, and Earl kept Dale's 5-word warning written on the inside cover of the oldest ledger. The Baines contract ledger, the avoidance ledger, and the fund ledgers were all scanned and copied in 2026 to the Cloud County Extension Archive so younger producers could study real decision trails, not myths. Earl himself still lived in the same modest farmhouse between Concordia and Cloud County roads, still drove the 1972 Chevrolet now reading 412,000 miles, and still kept personal spending below $19,000 a year. The left fender remained wired. He said replacing it would not improve yield. The 1974 John Deere 4430 still ran after disciplined maintenance, its hour meter long past the number that sales brochures once called practical. His audited net worth stood at $14,870,000, but his operating language did not change. Preserve margin, avoid fragile commitments, keep 1 year funded ahead. He had no foundation building with his name on stone. He had ledgers, acres, and people who could keep going without him. If you want more stories where arithmetic beats appearances, subscribe and keep following this series. If this one stayed with you, comment with the hardest financial trade-off you or your family has faced in farming, and say what number decided it. Share this with one person who looks at an old truck and assumes the wrong story, because that assumption still costs families real money. The county did not become free of hardship. Weather still punished confidence. Markets still moved without asking permission. Good people still faced bad years. What changed was the local framework for judging strength. A pressed shirt and new paint no longer ended the conversation. People asked about reserves, payment structure, and reset exposure. They asked whether a plan survived one poor crop year before they called it growth. That shift, more than any single check, was the deed inside the deed. The final image was never dramatic. Early light, a rusted pickup near a shed, a faded coat moving between bins, a farmer who looked from the road like he was barely getting by. Then, the closer truth: land paid for, obligations controlled, neighbors stabilized, and a county carrying forward one durable idea in numbers that anyone could verify. The handshake mattered. The check mattered more. The discipline made both mean something. On a cold Monday in January 2027, the first full audit meeting of the Ford Grounded Acres Fund filled Carla Pritchard's seed cleaning office before sunrise, boots ringing against the concrete floor and coffee steaming beside clipboards. Earl sat at the end of the table in a faded coat, with the wired fender truck visible through the frosted window, and he called each recipient by name without ceremony. Tom Abernathy laid down 12 quarterly reports with no missing pages, showed $2,300 in operating reserves, and read his mentorship log with Eli Dawson line by line. Spring cash flow planning, harvest basis decisions, and a written rule that no rent expansion would be signed without 1 full year of rent in reserve. Luis Mendez followed with repair records and principal receipts, then pointed to Marisol Vega's latest worksheet, where she cut per acre fuel expense from $47.20 to $39.80 through pass reduction and timing. Ben Holloway arrived last, as usual, carrying a yellow legal pad and a feed ledger that showed emergency purchases down again from $18,900 in 2023 to $6,740 in 2026. Earl did not praise anyone in long speeches. He asked one question each time. Is it durable? They answered with numbers, and the room stayed quiet in the way serious rooms do when arithmetic is holding. By the end of that meeting, Carla pinned the new county map on the wall and marked every stabilized operation with a blue tack. The 12 original recipients stood first, then 19 second-generation mentees, then 6 third-wave operators who had completed at least 2 years of independent reporting. 37 active farms were now submitting quarterly statements under the same plain template Earl had drafted at his kitchen table. Combined controlled acreage had reached 8,060, up from 4,980 at the 2026 checkpoint. Weighted average term debt among those farms sat at 1.9% because most land contracts were fixed and several were at zero. Revolving carry, once the silent killer in bad weather, had dropped below $310,000 across all participants combined, less than one average machinery package in the old model. Carla read the total asset estimate twice to make sure she did not transpose a digit: $52,740,000 in land, storage, equipment, and working capital. No one clapped. Tom only exhaled and said, "That is families staying put." Earl nodded once and wrote the total in his pocket ledger under a new column labeled Multiplier Verified. 3 days later, Earl drove to Salina with 2 bankers, one extension educator, and Harold Baines's grandson, at the request of the County Archive Board, carrying 3 boxes in the bed of the Chevrolet under a tarp tied down with the same practical knots he had used for decades. This was the board's formal accession of originals after the 2026 Extension Office scan copies had already been logged. Box 1 held the original Baines contract ledger with all 16 quarterly installments, each $16,000 entry intact, no late marks. Box 2 held the debt avoidance ledger with source sheets, quote comparisons, and the 30-year interest not paid calculation that had once stunned Wade. Box 3 held the dealer notes folder, including the old high-pressure quote sheets, the regional farm paper clipping from Wade's interview, and handwritten margin notes in Earl's block lettering. The archivist scanned each page in order, stamped chain of custody forms, and returned certified copies in acid-free sleeves. At 2:14 that afternoon, Earl signed the transfer register and left one instruction for public access metadata. Show the failures too. People need full context. The archivist asked if he wanted a plaque text. Earl said, "No plaque, index by year and decision." By the second week of April 2028, the antagonist thread reached its final practical turn in a training room at Wade Kessler's dealership, where 18 junior sales managers sat with printed worksheets titled Rate Risk Before Paint Color. One attended as a provisional observer, and 17 completed the full training certification by October. Wade wore the same crisp posture he had always carried, but his tone had changed from certainty to caution earned the hard way. He projected a side-by-side deal comparison on a white screen. One new 220-horsepower tractor financed at 8.4% over 7 years with total financing cost of $98,670 versus a certified used unit plus staged repair reserve with total 5-year cost lower by $141,300 and lower fixed payment volatility by 64%. He made every trainee calculate reset exposure at 3 adverse scenarios, then walked row by row to check the math. Midway through, he paused, looked toward the back where Earl had taken a folding chair, without announcement, and finished the sentence he had once stopped before at that county meeting. I knew this in pieces by 1988. I did not teach it because commissions were easier than truth. No one in the room laughed. Wade closed, by requiring written disclosure language in every proposal and changed compensation again so service retention mattered more than financed volume. His fate was clear by then. He retired in autumn 2029, solvent, publicly corrected, and remembered less for what he sold in his prime than for what he finally taught when it mattered. Summer 2029 brought hard heat and one more severe test. Wheat came short across parts of Cloud County, and two newer Mentee farms showed stress signals by July reporting. The fund committee met in Carla's office again, and this time Tom chaired while Earl listened. They approved two temporary payment deferrals tied to strict cost controls, no interest added, no hidden penalties, and both farms stayed current by the following spring after custom workbridge cash gaps. That scene mattered because Earl was no longer carrying operations by personal intervention. The system worked with him in the room and without him talking much. Harold Baines passed away that November at 84 in Wichita. At the funeral reception, his daughter handed Earl an envelope Harold had prepared in advance. Inside was a single-page note in steady handwriting. "Best deal I ever made. You brought numbers and kept your word." Earl folded it, did not speak for a long moment, and later placed it in the archive copy of the Baines file, so the record would carry both arithmetic and trust. By March 2030, the county roll call could be stated with precision. Earl Ford, 75, still operated his farm office from the same kitchen table, still drove the 1972 Chevrolet, now at 431,600 miles, and still kept household spending under $21,000 despite net worth growth tied mostly to land appreciation and retained earnings. Tom Abernathy leased and managed 420 acres with his son, returning part-time, reserve-funded, and note-disciplined. Luis Mendez transitioned 140 acres into his daughter's management under a written no-variable rate covenant. Carla Pritchard's cooperative served 39 member farms and had paid every employee on time through 6 volatile seasons. Ben Holloway remained on 160 acres, mentored each winter, and had not carried revolving input debt in 7 years. Eli Dawson bought his first 80-acre tract on a fixed contract with 18 months of payments already saved. Marisol Vega and her sister expanded to 240 acres, cash input first. Trent Holloway balanced 170 acres with welding income and taught equipment triage at winter workshops. Calvin Rusk's son, Dean, still leased his 90 acres conservatively and said the old auction memory had become instruction rather than fear. Dale Ford remained what he had been in the story all along, a 5-word warning on ledger paper that kept proving accurate when rates moved and rain did not. The physical details that people once treated as symbols of lack became local shorthand for something else. The wired left fender never got replaced because it did not change output. The kitchen clock that used to lose 5 minutes each month was finally repaired by Trent in 2028. And Earl joked that accurate time had not improved yields either, though it did make meeting starts cleaner. The 1974 John Deere 443, after one final transmission rebuild at 18,400 hours, was retired from primary tillage and moved to auger and light-duty work, maintained, greased, and stored under cover. Nothing was discarded for appearances. Everything had an assigned use, an assigned cost, and an assigned end. On an October morning in 2031, fog sat low across the bins as Earl stood with Carla and Tom by the gravel lane and watched 2 Mentee trucks pull out before daylight, both loaded, both paid for, both headed to contracts signed without variable traps. Earl handed Carla a slim envelope with the next 5-year governance plan for the fund, and a signed instruction that his estate would add $2,400,000 to the fund principal only if the mentorship clause remained intact and public reporting stayed mandatory. Carla read the condition twice and smiled without surprise. "Same rule," she said. Earl answered in 7 words. "Help compounds, or it leaks away." Appearance had never stopped lying in that county. It still did. New paint still looked like safety from across a lot. Worn cuffs still looked like strain from behind a coffee cup. The enduring correction was that more people now checked the numbers before they trusted the image. They asked about fixed costs, reserve months, reset exposure, and whether a plan survived one failed season. They asked because they had watched one farmer with a rusted truck, patched clothes, and a relentless ledger outlast 2 rate eras, hold land without liens, and turn private discipline into shared resilience. At first light, the Chevrolet started on the second turn, the old engine settling into a steady idle, while Frost lifted off the field road. Earl eased it into gear, drove past the bins, and disappeared between sections he had paid for the slow way, the durable way, with arithmetic that never needed applause. The handshake opened the door. The check proved intent. The decades of restraint kept that promise alive long after the ink dried.